We wanted to get somebody on that we really trusted, and we wanted to talk a little bit about this rare compromise on Iran. And Iran is changing all of the parameters of this deal that we supposedly had. And the Senate made a rare compromise, and we wanted to see if this works in our favor or not. As I read it last night, it seems like the Senate once again surrendered their power, and Stu said the exact opposite, so we thought we'd get Ben Sasse's read. Hello, Ben. How are you?
Glenn, good to be with you. Can I pretend I'm a politician and split the difference?
No.
First of all, Ben, we should ask, because you've been there for, 2 months now. Have you turned yet? Like The Walking Dead, have you turned? Are you a walker now, a Senate walker?
Something like that. No, I am still not a politician.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Good.
So you would say this is in the middle then, or do you like it?
Let's talk about it like this. The macro on having a nuclear Iran is a horrible idea, and for 36 years, both Republicans and Democrats in this country all agreed to that. And the Obama administration has pivoted from the historic goal of preventing a nuclear Iran to trying to manage the arrival of nuclear proliferation across the Middle East. So it's dreadful what's happening at the big picture level. This specific bill that was passed out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee unanimously is a small deal, but it's a small step in the right direction, but it's not big enough to change the course of how big the problems are. But this Senate compromise is more good than bad, but it's small.
Because it just gives us a chance to essentially veto this deal.
I thought the Senate has that right.
No.
You have the right.
Well, if it were being submitted by the Obama administration as if we had three separate but equal branches of government that check and balance one another in a constitutional system, they've got a pen and they've got a phone, and executive unilateralism means to the Obama administration that they can just make up anything that they want. And so they're trying to strike this deal with Iran, going completely around the Congress and going straight to the UN. And so a treaty would have to be submitted to us. They've never framed this as a treaty, even though it's far more important than many things that go by treaty. For example, the last 23 civilian nuclear power agreements around the world, I think the number is 23, have been submitted to the Senate for approval under treaty-like structures. In this case, they were just going to ignore the Congress. And so what Corker has been trying to do with this Bob Corker, the senator from Tennessee, is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. He's been trying to get a piece of legislation passed called the Congressional Review Act, which at least gives us the ability to express satisfaction or dissatisfaction with what the Obama administration is trying to cook as a truly bad deal. But here's why it is still a step in the right direction, though it's tiny. It will at least allow us to get access to knowledge for the American people of what's in the deal. The Obama administration's been trying to cut a deal with Tehran where they and Tehran have rival talking points out in the world, and the people of the United States don't even know what's in it. The people of America have a right to know what's in this deal. It's going to be bad, but we need to know what's in there, and the way you get some transparency into it is by the Congress knowing.
So here's how I read this, Ben. Why are we negotiating with the president in the first place? Why aren't you guys just going and saying, you're not doing this? You can't do this. You can't do this without us.
Well, because the administration largely owns the media, and they go out and they tell a story that the United States has struck a deal, and they want to go to the UN Security Council and use this as the occasion to waive all sanctions. How is that possible? That's possible because there was a flaw in some legislation that was passed many years ago in the way that these sanctions are being imposed on Iran. Let's be clear about who Iran is. They're the world's largest state sponsor of terror. They are funding Shia militias among at least 5 of their neighbors, trying to destabilize regimes. They are horrible actors. But there is one thing that's worse than Iran right now, and that is the short-term threat of Sunni jihadist terrorists that are building non-state organizations like ISIS or ISIL. So it's essentially al-Qaeda rebranded. And so in the middle of the frenzy of ISIL capturing most of eastern Syria and lots of northwestern Iraq, many people in the Middle East are looking for some form of stability. And so when the Shia militias come in, they're sometimes a less bad option than the non-state actors. The Iranians are under huge sanctions. That's a good thing. They have about $130 billion of offshore revenues right now, and almost 90% of those funds are frozen. But the Russians in particular would like to end these sanctions regimes because their economy is failing, and they'd like to sell armaments to Iran. And so in the midst of this, instead of leading the Obama administration, instead of leading and ratcheting up of sanctions, the Obama administration is trying to lead the capitulation to Iranian demands.
And this is more than just being able to review this deal, Ben. This is also, if I'm understanding it correctly, you give it a month to look at the deal and review it, but then also have a chance to block Obama from removing the sanctions, which is fundamental to the deal, and Iran won't agree to it without that. So in effect, you have with this bill veto on the Iranian deal, don't you?
So a couple of things. Glenn's point, so you and I have been on the same side of this, and now I hate to go against you because you're my partner in this. And so we don't want Glenn to ever be right.
Right, of course.
Here's what's being turned on its head. Under the constitutional arrangement, the president is supposed to negotiate the best deal you can for treaties. Then you submit it to the Senate, and it needs a two-thirds vote. Under this new world, you would essentially have a resolution of approval or disapproval, and given the Senate rules, it would take about 60 votes to be able to say, no, we think this is terrible. But well before we ever get to that point, because we can get lost here in process in a hurry, we would at least be able to, as representatives of the people, be able to get access to knowledge of what is in this deal. The Obama administration has been claiming this is verifiable, as if the IAEA has typically been right in the past when they've tried to dig in and find out things like the drift toward a nuclear North Korea. We had a 36-year consensus in this country that we should never have a nuclear Iran. And the president continually posits this false choice between we have to accept whatever the worst deal is the Iranians will let us have, or we have to go to immediate war. That's nonsense. And when you talk to Nebraskans, they know it's nonsense, and your listeners know it's nonsense. There's a third choice, which is you negotiate from a position of strength where the Iranians know we mean business and we don't intend to allow a nuclear Iran, and our allies in the region don't want a nuclear Iran. And lo and behold, we'd be having a whole totally different discussion than the way we negotiate from this posture of weakness.
Isn't it possible, though, Ben, that this whole process is moot anyway because the Iranians are already changing the deal so radically? I mean, Kerry was asked, well, what happens if they change the deal after you've already announced that the framework has been agreed upon? And he just said, well, that's not going to happen. And it already has. It's already happened. And so they cut the time in half from 10 years to 5.
They want 4,000 extra centrifuges.
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, the deal should be off anyway, shouldn't it?
It should. So let's just name 2 or 3 of those variables you named, because there are about 6 or 7 things that are going wrong in the Kerry-Obama negotiation with the Iranians. But let's take your centrifuges point. The right number of centrifuges for Iran to have is 0. Mm-hmm. There should be no uranium enrichment in the world's largest state sponsor of terror. Your listeners should be asking themselves, these people have been funding Shia militias across the Middle East and North Africa that have intentionally tried to target U.S. troops. Why would we believe when they have access to nuclear material that they would not ultimately also share it with terror organizations? So the right number of centrifuges is 0. We know that they have around 19,000. The Obama administration said at the beginning that they were going to negotiate to get them down to about 1,000. They've now pivoted to something more like 6,000. The right number should be 0. That you can make the same argument about the way anytime, any place inspection should work. The Iranians want to set up a regime of cat and mouse, like what was the case with Saddam Hussein heading to 2003. And the Kerry response to this is, well, we would have a snapback, that if they ever didn't keep their commitments under this agreement, all of the sanctions would snap back into place. Well, a couple of problems with that. First is they got $130 billion offshore right now, and if they get sanctions relief, they're going to get access to most of that $130 billion. They've been spending a lot of their money to fund terror operations beyond their borders. What do they think they're going to spend the new $130 billion on? And number 2, if these sanctions regimes were ever going to snap back into place, you'd need groups like the Russians and the French and the Chinese to all cooperate with that, and it would be a bureaucratic, litigated process. You know we're in a bad place in a negotiation right now when the French are trying to hold out for harder requirements from the U.S. administration.
Senator, we appreciate your time. We know you're on a busy schedule. I would like to ask you just to look into this Judicial Watch report about ISIS being on our border. There's conflicting reports on it. I happen to believe the Judicial Watch people that we have some serious issues going on our border with ISIS on both sides of our border. And if you could, when you find out some details, report back to us, because we'd like to know if it's real or not.
Thanks. I spend a lot of time in a classified setting, and we're trying to learn about some of these issues, and I would love to report back to you. So
great.
Thanks
Thank you very much.
On.
Appreciate it. Ben Sasse from Nebraska.